Welcome back to the Marvel Podcast for gifted listeners. On today's episode, we're going to step back into the 70s for a brief moment while we move into the 80s and 90s and see Marvel hit its highest of highs and hit one of their lowest points that they truly did not recover from until the launch of the MCU in 2008. So now let's turn back the clock to 1975. Until this year, the X-Men comics had been a perpetual cycle of reprints with new covers since 1970. Basically, they were printing the same stories with different covers, just over and over again, so that the X-Men still had a presence on comic stand shelves. Al Landau, the president of Marvel Comics in 1975, had been distributing Marvel Comics to other countries. So he suggested to Stan Lee and Roy Thomas, who was another writer at the time, that they should create an X-Men team consisting of characters from all around the world. This way, countries that the books were being distributed to could feel represented. Funny enough, all the characters they created were from countries that the books were not being distributed to. But in giant-sized X-Men #1, the world would be introduced to now famous characters such as Storm, Colossus, Nightcrawler, and the reintroduction of the now famous Wolverine. After one issue of the giant-sized X-Men, the original writer, Len Wein, was too busy to continue the series. This led to the now legendary team of Chris Claremont and John Byrne. This duo would go on to create some of the most memorable X-Men stories, such as The Dark Phoenix and The Days of Futures Past, which both stories have been adapted into both animation and live-action movies to varying levels of success. Personally, X-Men Days of Future Past has been my favorite live-action X-Men movie up to date, but the road cut specifically. The theatrical is just not as good as the road cut, just because of a few scenes. You should check it out if you get the chance. But, unfortunately, the Claremont-Byrne partnership would not last long. Claremont would go on to write more stories for Marvel, not just X-Men titles. Meanwhile, Byrne, in 1981, would go on to write the Fantastic Four, and during his Fantastic Four run, this is when the Invisible Girl was upgraded to the Invisible Woman. He would also write Alpha Flight comics, and he would also write an Incredible Hulk run. And during this run, that's when the Hulk married his longtime love, Betty Ross, who was supposed to return after 16 long years without a live-action appearance. The following year, in 1976, we would see the first DC Marvel crossover, Superman vs. Spider-Man. In this story, Doc Ock and Lex Luthor team up. There is a brief sequence where Superman believes all the media hype that Spider-Man is a villain, or a menace, and the two start to fight. Peter realizes what has happened, calls off the fight, and then the two team up to defeat Doc Ock and Lex Luthor. We will discuss all that and even more crossovers in a future episode. And then, our last stop in the 70s before we move on is in 1979, which is the year that Stan Lee had created She-Hulk. She had been created as a preemptive way to prevent other creators from creating a female version of the Hulk. Since her debut, she has been breaking the fourth wall and even talking to the writers and audience. Byrne was the one who really cemented her fourth wall breaking. And writer Roger Stearns, who had worked on The Avengers where She-Hulk was a member, established that she liked being She-Hulk. She didn't have the dual personality like Bruce Banner, which they translated into the She-Hulk Attorney at Law TV series. The now famous Frank Miller began his career with Marvel by penciling a 17-page story, The Master Assassin of Mars, Part 3. After this introduction to Marvel, Miller would be a fill-in for the Spectacular Spider-Man. Miller later began inking Daredevil comics, starting with issue number 158. Within 10 issues, Miller would become the writer for Daredevil, and his first writing credit would be on Daredevil number 168. And this issue was the introduction of Miller's creation, Elektra. He would write this storyline until 1983, when unfortunately the Daredevil book was cancelled. But in 1986, Miller would return to the Man Without Fear and write Daredevil Born Again. In Daredevil Born Again, it began to show that Marvel Comics were becoming more serious. Also, at the time, while Miller was making a name for himself and the new heroine She-Hulk was being created by Stan Lee, Stan was also busy as ever, serving as vice president of Marvel Animation in Hollywood. He would create shows such as Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends in 1981 and the Incredible Hulk animated series in 1982. And these shows were actually animated, unlike the previous animated shows of the 60s. And one thing that was interesting is that the Spider-Man show, if you ever see clips of it, you'll notice that only webbing is on Spider-Man's mask, not on the sides like his traditional costume. And this is because it was easier to animate just the webs on his mask because of how much movement there was with his body. As the comics started to mature, the beginnings of the American graphic novel began. These were more mature stories than the ones that were being published in just regular comics, and they were being published under the Marvel umbrella. First of which was in 1983 with the title The Death of Captain Marvel. And this is, of course, talking about Marvel, not Carol Danvers. Carol would take over the mantle of Captain Marvel after this death. But this paved the way for a new way of storytelling, allowing them to tell more mature stories. Also at the same time, Marvel began a new way to pay their writers and artists with royalties on the books they would have a hand in. This way, instead of just being paid for the pages, being paid to ink and write the pages, they would actually get a little kickback every time that that book would be sold. The man who pioneered paid these writers was Jim Shooter. At the time of this change, Jim Shooter was the editor-in-chief at Marvel. He would also go on to write the original Marvel superhero Secret Wars. Shooter would be the editor-in-chief for a decade and a half before turning the reins over to Tom DeFalco. One last note on 1983. This is when the first official Marvel handbook had been published that year. This was the first time the term the Marvel Universe had been canonized in name. As the 80s came to an end, Marvel was sold to a new publishing company, New World Entertainment. In 1988, New World then sold Marvel to the McAndrews and Forbes Group, a massive conglomerate owned by Ron Perlman, not the comedian. This sale would lead to a downfall that Marvel did not see coming and led to disaster, to say the least. The 1990s saw a boom in comic sales and a new marketing technique. In 1991, Marvel hit the stock market for the first time with its new owner, Ron Perlman, retaining 60% of the shares. Also during this new decade, artists began drawing heroes and heroines with more exaggerated qualities. For the men, the muscles were just big and bulgy and so far past a realistic human standard. One, I would probably say, famous examples of this is the Captain America panel, where his chest is just huge, taking up probably like 3/4 of the panel. And just like, I've seen that made fun of so many times on the internet. But, you know, it was the 90s. This is what they did. Also during the 90s, this is when they brought in the now famous comic artist, Todd McFarlane, who would draw Spider-Man comics until 1992, when him and 2 other Marvel employees would leave the company and start their own comics brand, Image Comics. We'll see Image Comics again a little bit later. So, one of the reasons that there was a boom in comic sales in the 90s was that newspapers were printing articles about how copies of vintage comics from the golden and silver age of comics were being sold for thousands of dollars. Were being sold for thousands of dollars. This meant that buyers were now buying not just one copy. They would usually buy at least 2. One for them to read and, you know, if anything got messed up, fine. And then they'd buy a second copy and seal it away, like, literally as soon as it left the store. That way that the sealed one could grow in value and then hopefully be sold for a decent chunk of change down the line. And you know, the sentiment is still around today among many comic fans. I myself I only buy one copy. I usually buy it, read it, read it carefully, and then I will store it inside a plastic protector with a back. And do I think any of these are really going to be super valuable one day? Not really. But it is nice to preserve them, just because, I don't know, I think it's nice to preserve stuff like that. And then, one more reason for the boom in comic sales was the introduction of what we now know as the variant cover. Variant covers are essentially just different artwork styles on the front of the book. An example is the Amazing Spider-Man run that started in 2022. The first cover had Spider-Man on it, and there was another one that showed split down the middle of Black Cat and Mary Jane. And there was another one that showed Spider-Man's Rogue Gallery beneath it. So you can see how this could contribute to the boom in sales. An example in the 90s that was honestly a little overboard was Todd McFarlane's Spider-Man #1. This issue came with 8 different versions of the cover. There was an unbagged silver first edition, a bagged silver first edition, a bag and unbagged regular first edition, a bagged newsstand edition, the gold second edition with Spider-Man in the UPC box, and then a gold edition without him in the UPC box. And finally, there's the super special platinum edition. So you can see that if there was a diehard collector, they were going to pick up 8 different copies of this one book. And say that there was 1,000 comic stores in the United States. One person per store buys all 8 copies. That's 8,000 copies just off, 1,000 people. So you could tell how numbers got really high. And then another marketing technique would be that some comic books would be sold with trading cards, such as in X-Force #1. There was 5 different trading cards, but the trick was that each copy came with a different trading card. So essentially you'd have to buy 5 copies of X-Force #1 so that you could then get the entire set. The 90s also brought in more event comics, like the superhero Secret Wars of the past. We would see the X-Men Age of Apocalypse, and the now infamous Spider-Man Clone Saga storyline, as well as the big event known as Infinity War, which the Infinity Saga of the MCU is loosely based off of. So that means that people weren't just buying the one-off books to get the one story that was centralized to that one book. They were buying, 5, 6 different books so that they knew how this story that was started was going to end. So, again, numbers just went up and up and up. While the stories that had made Marvel a success were still coming out, they also started to publish some more darker, some more mature storylines, so that, the people who had grown up with the Silver Age could now read some more mature stories. And these stories would showcase characters such as the Punisher, who, he had no problem mowing down bad guys with his guns, and also had a giant skull on his chest. There's also Ghost Rider with his flaming skull and Spirit of Vengeance, and the villain Venom, who had been introduced in the 90s, who he really wanted to murder and eat Spider-Man. Unfortunately, during the 90s, tragedy would strike the comic world in 1994, with the death of Jack Kirby. Thus, Marvel had truly lost one of its original staff members, and Marvel and comics had lost one of the most influential comic creators of his time. And I know he didn't work for Marvel, but it was still a sad moment in the comics world. And now, the fall of the Marvel Empire. In 1995, Marvel had accumulated a lot of debt that they struggled to pay off. So, in 1996, they wound up filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. One way that they tried to shrink this debt to dig themselves out of bankruptcy was by auctioning off the film rights to their characters. The X-Men, Fantastic Four, and Daredevil, they all went to Fox. Universal Studios gained the film rights to The Incredible Hulk, and Sony, of course, got Spider-Man. When these characters were all sold off, there was a clause in all these contracts that if the character was not used within 14 years, then the rights would revert back to Marvel. Hence why, yes, we had the Daredevil movie with Ben Affleck, but because Daredevil had never made another appearance, the rights reverted back to Marvel, and then we were able to get the Netflix show. In 1997, Toy Biz, the company that had the exclusive toy rights to Marvel toys, would gain control of Marvel and reorganize it into Marvel Enterprises. While this was happening, the entire comic industry was suffering. Nearly half of all comic shops had to shut their doors, and Marvel had to outsource some of their comics to Image Comics to write and ink several titles. Funny how the guys who left Marvel wound up inking pages for them because Marvel couldn't afford the in-house help. 1998, we would see the release of the first Blade movie, which was the first major blockbuster success for Marvel. Marvel would also, after gaining their footing back after recovering from that, bankruptcy, would venture into other avenues, where they opened a Marvel-themed restaurant named Marvel Mania. This restaurant, on their menu, would feature various sections, such as blazing beverages, astonishing appetizers, and sandwiches. Enough said. There would also be diabolical desserts based off of the villains. And, each of them were themed after various heroes and villains. The Marvel Mania restaurant would only operate from 1998 to 1999. Also, in 1999, Marvel would open, in conjunction with Universal in Orlando, the Marvel Superheroes Island. Even though the 90s had been a turbulent time for Marvel, they made it through and looked on to the new millennium with hopeful eyes. So, next episode, we will finish out this Marvel history timeline, starting with the 2000s, going all the way to 2024, when these episodes were written and recorded. Now let's look back at the top 5 things that we learned today. Number 1. In the 80s, Marvel started getting more serious with their stories, and the 90s continued to push that more mature way of storytelling, even more so than the 80s. Number 2. Marvel would have comic sales in the 7-figure range due to offering variant covers of the same issue, as well as putting sets of trading cards in some issues, so customers would have to buy 5 issues to collect them all. Number 3. A contribution to the boom in comic sales in the 90s was because of a newspaper reporting on comics being sold for thousands of dollars, so people saw us as a way to invest in their futures by buying books to one day resell for profit. Number 4. In 1996, Marvel auctioned off the film rights to their characters, and that is why certain characters were unable to appear in the MCU for a while because their rights belonged to different companies. And number 5. To reinvigorate the interest in the X-Men comics, they put together a team of mutants from different countries around the world, and they would be brought together to create the all-new X-Men. And memorial mention of Jack Kirby's passing in 1994. Next episode, we'll move into the new millennia and look at how Marvel changed with the world once again as the world had changed around it. You can find us on Instagram at TMPFGL, a subreddit with the same name, and on YouTube at the Marvel Podcast for Gifted Listeners. This episode was written, recorded, and edited by myself, James Basinski. Intro music, outro music, and the timeline sound was sourced from freesound.org. Until next time, gifted listeners, thank you for listening, and Excelsior!